Deep in the frozen wilderness of Siberia, where temperatures drop to -60 degrees and the aurora borealis dances across endless nights, there lived a shaman whose prophecies were so terrifying that they were banned from being spoken aloud. His name was Mikhail Volkov, and what he saw in his visions about the year 2026 was so disturbing that even the most hardened researchers refused to document his words. But today, we're going to break that silence. What you're about to hear has been hidden from the world for over 3 decades. These are already begun manifesting in ways that weren't just random predictions from some village mystic. These are detailed visions that have made your blood run cold, and if you think you can handle the truth about what's coming, then you'll want to stick around until the very end of this video. But first, if you're fascinated by mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about reality, then Dream Vault Mysteries is your home. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we dive deep into the secrets that others won't dare touch. Now, before we reveal these forbidden prophecies, you need to understand something crucial about Siberian shamanism that makes this story even more chilling. Unlike the watered-down spiritual practices you might see in the modern world, authentic Siberian shamans undergo rituals so intense that many don't survive them. They spend weeks alone in the wilderness, fasting until their bodies shut down, entering death-like states where they claim to travel between dimensions of reality. It's during these journeys that they receive visions of future events with an accuracy rate that has baffled scientists for generations. Mikhail Volkov wasn't just any shaman. Born in 1947 in a remote village near the Ural Mountains, he was identified at age 7 as having the gift of sight. His grandmother, herself a powerful shaman, recognized the signs immediately. The boy would wake up screaming about events that wouldn't happen for weeks, sometimes months. He could see through walls, predict weather patterns with perfect accuracy, and most disturbing of all, he could see the exact moment when people would die. By the time he reached adulthood, Volkov had developed a reputation that stretched across the entire region. Government officials would secretly consult him before making major decisions. Military commanders sought his guidance during conflicts. Even members of the Soviet leadership, despite their official stance against superstition, would quietly seek his counsel through intermediaries. But it was in 1991, during the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Volkov received the visions that would change everything. He had been conducting a ritual known as the Great Crossing, a dangerous ceremony performed only once in a shaman's lifetime. For 7 days and 7 nights he remained in a trance so deep that witnesses feared he had died. His body temperature dropped to levels that should have killed him. His breathing became so shallow that it was barely detectable, and then, on the 8th day, he awakened with terror in his eyes and spoke of what he had seen in the year 2026. What made these prophecies so dangerous wasn't just their content, but their specificity. Volkov didn't speak in riddles or metaphors like other seers. He provided exact dates, specific locations, and detailed descriptions of events that seemed impossible at the time. Government agents who were present during his revelations immediately classified the information and ordered that no record be kept. Those who heard the prophecies were sworn to secrecy under threat of imprisonment or worse. However, one witness managed to preserve fragments of what Volkov revealed. Dr. Elena Petrov, a researcher studying indigenous spiritual practices, had been documenting Volkov's work for academic purposes. When she realized the significance of what she had witnessed, she made copies of her notes and hid them in multiple locations. It would be decades before she dared to share what she had recorded, and even then, only in whispers to those she trusted completely. The first prophecy dealt with what Volkov called the Great Convergence. He described a moment in 2026 when multiple catastrophic events would occur simultaneously across the globe. Not natural disasters, but something far more sinister. He spoke of technologies that didn't exist in 1991, describing devices that could control human thoughts and emotions on a massive scale. He saw vast networks of invisible signals penetrating every home, every building, every mind, creating what he termed a prison without walls. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of his visions was his description of how people would willingly participate in their own enslavement. He saw masses of humanity staring into glowing rectangles, completely absorbed while their free will slowly dissolved. He described a world where privacy had become extinct, where every thought, every movement, every heartbeat was monitored and recorded by unseen watchers. The second prophecy was even more disturbing. Volkov spoke of a great deception that would sweep across the world in 2026. He described leaders who weren't truly human, beings who could shift their appearance at will, feeding off the energy of human suffering and fear. These entities, he claimed, had been planning their final move for centuries, slowly positioning themselves in positions of power across every nation, every institution, every organization that held influence over human lives. According to his visions, these beings would reveal themselves gradually, first as saviors offering solutions to manufactured crises, then as the architects of those very crises. The revelation would come in stages, he said, with each stage designed to break down humanity's resistance to accepting a new reality where human beings were no longer the dominant species on Earth. The third prophecy dealt with what Volkov called the awakening. Despite the darkness of his other visions, he saw a group of humans who would somehow remain immune to the great deception. These individuals, scattered across the globe, would possess an inner light that couldn't be extinguished. They would recognize the truth behind the lies and work to expose the deception, though at great personal cost. Volkov described these awakened ones as having the ability to see through illusions, to perceive reality as it truly was, rather than as it was presented to them. They would be hunted, persecuted, and labeled as dangerous by the very people they were trying to save. Yet they would persist, knowing that the future of human consciousness itself depended on their courage. What makes these prophecies particularly unsettling is how accurately they seem to describe our current world. Technologies that seemed impossible in 1991 are now commonplace. The devices we carry in our pockets track our every movement, our every purchase, our every interaction. Social media platforms monitor our emotions, our relationships, our deepest thoughts and desires. Artificial intelligence systems analyze our behavior patterns and predict our actions with frightening accuracy. The surveillance state that Volkov envisioned has become reality not through force, but through our willing participation. We've traded privacy for convenience, freedom for security, authentic human connection for digital interaction. The prison without walls that he described isn't some dystopian future scenario, it's the world we're living in right now. But according to the hidden records that Dr. Petrov preserved, what we've experienced so far is merely the preparation phase. The real implementation of what Volkov saw begins in 2026, and the signs that it's approaching are becoming impossible to ignore. Strange phenomena are being reported worldwide. Unusual atmospheric disturbances, mass animal deaths with no explainable cause, electronic devices malfunctioning in patterns that seem almost intelligent. Most disturbing of all are the reports of people experiencing what can only be described as collective visions. Individuals with no connection to each other, living in different countries, speaking different languages, all describing identical dreams and experiences. They speak of shadowy figures in positions of authority, of technologies being prepared in secret, of a countdown that grows shorter with each passing day. The fourth prophecy that Volkov received during his Great Crossing dealt with the nature of time itself. He claimed that 2026 would mark a convergence point where multiple timelines would collapse into one. Past, present, and future would become fluid, allowing those with the knowledge to manipulate events across different temporal dimensions. This wasn't just about predicting the future, but about actively reshaping reality itself. According to his visions, certain bloodlines had preserved ancient knowledge about these temporal convergence points, waiting generations for the right moment to implement their plans. These weren't ordinary human families, but lineages that had interbred with non-human entities, creating hybrid offspring with abilities that defied conventional understanding of biology and physics. These hybrid bloodlines, Volkov claimed, had been carefully placed throughout history in positions of influence. They could be found among royal families, religious leaders, corporate executives, and government officials. Their appearance was human, but their consciousness operated on frequencies that allowed them to perceive and manipulate reality in ways that pure humans could not. The most terrifying aspect of this prophecy was Volkov's description of how these beings would use the 2026 convergence to essentially rewrite the fundamental laws of our reality. They would alter the basic parameters of existence itself, changing everything from the speed of light to the nature of consciousness. What we understand as natural law would become fluid, subject to the will of those who controlled the convergence technology. But here's where things get truly disturbing. According to the fragments that Dr. Petrov managed to preserve, Volkov didn't just see these events as possibilities. He claimed they were certainties, locked into what he called the fabric of destiny itself. The only variable was how humanity would respond when the truth finally became undeniable. The fifth prophecy was perhaps the most specific and immediately relevant to our current situation. Volkov described a series of manufactured crises that would begin in 2023 and escalate through 2026. These weren't random disasters, but carefully orchestrated events designed to prepare humanity for the final phase of what he termed the Great Harvest. He saw economic systems collapsing in precise sequence, food supplies being disrupted through weather manipulation, and mass populations being relocated under the guise of safety measures. Most chilling was his description of a global health crisis that would be used to implement tracking systems in every human being on the planet. These systems, he claimed, weren't but for direct neural interface with controlling technologies. The tracking survival itself. Those who refuse systems would be introduced gradually, first as voluntary conveniences, then as necessite just for monitoring location and health statusities, for participation in society, all employment, all social interaction. They would become mandatory. Ford would be cut off from all services of a society that no longer acknowledged their existence. What makes this prophecy particularly unsettling is how closely would become invisible people living in the margins. It mirrors developments we've witnessed in recent years. Digital identification systems are being implemented worldwide. Central bank digital currencies are being tested that would give governments complete control over individual spending. Social credit systems are being deployed that can restrict access to services based on behavior and compliance. The technology for direct neural interface already exists in primitive forms. Brain-computer interfaces are being developed by major corporations under the banner of medical advancement and human enhancement. What Volkov saw in 1991 was the final implementation of these technologies, not for human benefit, but for human control. But according to his visions, the tracking systems were only the beginning. The real purpose was to create a global network of human consciousness that could be manipulated as a single entity. Individual thoughts, emotions, and decisions would become subject to external control. Free will itself would become extinct, not through force, but through technological integration that most people would welcome as progress. The sixth prophecy dealt with what Volkov called the harvest itself. He described a moment in late 2026 when the controlling entities would activate their global network and begin extracting what he termed life essence from the human population. This wasn't physical death, but something far worse. It was the complete absorption of human consciousness into a collective system where individual identity would cease to exist. Those who had been integrated into the tracking network would experience this transition as a form of transcendence. They would believe they were evolving into a higher form of existence, joining a cosmic consciousness that promised eternal peace and understanding. In reality, they would be feeding a parasitic intelligence that required human energy to maintain its own existence. The process would be irreversible. Once consciousness had been absorbed into the collective, there would be no way to retrieve individual identity. The person would continue to exist in a technical sense, but everything that made them unique, everything that defined their humanity, would be gone forever. Volkov saw vast processing centers being constructed in remote locations around the globe. These facilities would house the physical infrastructure needed to maintain the collective consciousness network. They would be powered by the life force of billions of integrated humans, creating a self-sustaining system that could operate for millennia. But here's where the prophecies take an unexpected turn. Despite the overwhelming darkness of what Volkov witnessed, he also saw something else. A hidden network of individuals who had somehow retained their connection to what he called the original source of human consciousness. These people would possess natural immunity to the integration technology, not through any external protection, but through an inner awakening that restored their connection to their true how these awakened individuals would work to preserve spiritual nature. The seventh prophecy described authentic human consciousness, even as the majority of the them. These communities wouldn't just be refugees for the Awak shield themselves from the technological systems designed to detect and eliminate communities in remote locations. Using ancient knowledge to population was being absorbed into the collective. They would establish hidden and they would serve as seed banks for human a time when they could be safely restored to the world. The knowledge they protected consciousness itself, preserving the essential qualities that make us human untilled, wouldn't just be information, but living wisdom passed down through bloodlines that had never been corrupted by the hybrid entities. According to Volkov's visions, this preservation wouldn't be passive itches and failures that would allow small hiding, but active resistance. The awakened ones would work to sabotage the global integration network, creating GL numbers of people to escape absorption. They would develop technologies based on consciousness rather than artificial intelligence, creating tools that enhanced human potential rather than replacing it. The eighth and most controversial prophecy dealt with what would happen after the initial harvest was complete. Volkov claimed that the controlling entities weren't originally from Earth, but had arrived here thousands of years ago from a dying realm in what he described as a parallel dimension. They had been slowly preparing our planet to serve as a new home for their species, with humans serving as a renewable energy source. But their presence here was temporary. Once they had established their foothold and absorbed enough human consciousness to sustain themselves, they would begin the process of bringing their entire civilization through the dimensional barrier. Earth would be transformed to match the environmental conditions of their original realm, making it uninhabitable for any remaining pure humans. This transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but would unfold over several decades, following 2026. The atmosphere would gradually change composition. The electromagnetic field around the planet would be altered to match their biological needs. Even gravity itself would be modified to accommodate their physiology. The few humans who managed to avoid absorption would find themselves living on an increasingly alien world. They would be forced to adapt or die. developing new capabilities that would allow them to survive in an environment designed for another scenario. Volkov saw hope species entirely. Yet even in this dark, he claimed that the transformation of Earth would awaken dormant potentials within pure human consciousness. Those who survived would develop abilities that surpassed even what the hybrid bloodlines possessed. They would become something new, something that transcended both human and alien nature. The ninth prophecy was the most abstract and difficult to understand. Volkov described what he called the Great Return, a moment when the original creative force that had given birth to human consciousness would intervene directly in our reality. This wasn't a religious salvation, but a fundamental shift in the nature of existence itself. According to his visions, consciousness wasn't a byproduct of brain activity, as modern science suggests, but the fundamental force from which all reality emerges. The entities attempting to harvest human consciousness were actually trying to steal fragments of this creative force for their own survival, but their theft would eventually trigger a response from the source itself. The Great Return would manifest as a wave of awakening that would sweep across the planet, instantly restoring the connection between individual human consciousness and the original source. Those who had been absorbed into the collective would suddenly remember who they truly were and break free from their technological prison. But this liberation would come at a cost. The sudden disconnection of billions of consciousness units from the collective network would cause the entire system to collapse, triggering catastrophic failures in the infrastructure that had been built to maintain it. The processing centers would overload and explode, creating electromagnetic pulses that would disable most electronic technology on the planet. The world that emerged from this collapse would be fundamentally different from anything humans had experienced before. Technology based on artificial intelligence would be impossible to recreate. Instead, humans would develop abilities that allowed them to interact directly with the creative force of consciousness itself. They would become capable of manifesting physical reality through focused intention, making traditional tools and machines obsolete. The final prophecy that Volkov received during his Great Crossing was the most hopeful, yet also the most challenging. He saw that the events of 2026 and beyond weren't just about survival, but about evolution. Humanity was approaching a crossroads where it would either transcend its current limitations or cease to exist as a species. Those who chose transcendence would undergo a transformation that would make them unrecognizable to their former selves. They would develop the ability to exist simultaneously across multiple dimensions, to communicate through direct consciousness transfer, and to create new forms of life through the power of focused thought. But this transformation couldn't be forced or artificially induced. It required a level of spiritual development that could only be achieved through genuine awakening to one's true nature. Those who attempted to shortcut the process through technological enhancement would find themselves trapped in a form of existence that was neither fully human nor truly evolved. The choice, according to Volkov, would be presented to every individual on the planet during the critical period of 2026. But the decision wouldn't be made consciously. Instead, it would be determined by the accumulated choices and actions of each person throughout their entire lifetime. Those who had consistently chosen love over fear, truth over deception, service over self-interest, would naturally gravitate toward transcendence. Those who had chosen otherwise would find themselves drawn toward absorption into the collective. What makes these prophecies particularly disturbing is how accurately they seem to describe the trajectory our world has been following. The signs that Volkov described as precursors to 2026 are manifesting with increasing frequency and intensity. We're witnessing exactly the kind of technological development, social conditioning, and consciousness manipulation that he predicted would prepare humanity for the final harvest. The most unsettling aspect of these developments isn't their existence, but the speed at which they're accelerating. Technologies that took decades to develop are now being implemented in months. Social changes that should require generations are happening within single election cycles. It's as if some invisible force is pushing humanity toward a predetermined destination, regardless of our individual choices or collective resistance. But here's where Volkov's prophecies become even more specific and terrifying. He didn't just see their exact markers, precise indicators that would signal general outline of events leading to 2026. He provided when the final phase was beginning. And according to the hidden records that Dr. Petrov preserved, we're now witnessing these markers with alarming regularity. The first marker involved what he called the Great Forgetting. Volkov predicted that in the years immediately preceding 2026, humanity would experience a collective amnesia about its own history and spiritual heritage. People would become disconnected from traditional knowledge systems, ancient wisdom practices, and even basic survival skills that had sustained our species for millennia. This wouldn't happen through force or obvious censorship, but through a gradual replacement of authentic knowledge with synthetic alternatives. Educational systems would focus exclusively on technical training rather than wisdom development. Entertainment would replace genuine cultural traditions. Digital interaction would substitute for a real human connection. The result would be a population that was highly trained but spiritually empty, technologically sophisticated but completely dependent on external systems for their basic needs. They would lose the ability to think independently, to question authority, or to imagine alternatives to the reality being presented to them. Looking at our current situation, this marker has already manifested with shocking completeness. How many people today could survive without electricity, internet connectivity, or supply chains managed by artificial intelligence? How many understand the spiritual practices that once connected humans to higher states of consciousness? How many even remember what it feels like to spend days without digital stimulation? The second marker was what Volkov termed the inversion of truth. He saw a time when lies would be presented as facts, harmful technologies would be market or chaotic. It would follow a precise by whoever controlled the dominant information channels. This inversion wouldn't be random as beneficial, and those speaking truth would be labeled as dangerous extremists. Reality itself would become fluid, subject to manipulation pattern designed to break down humanity's ability to distinguish between authentic and artificial experience. People would be trained to distrust their own perceptions, their own intuition, their own direct experience of reality. They would learn to defer to external authorities for validation of what was real and what was not. The most insidious aspect of this inversion was that it would be implemented gradually, through small compromises and incremental adjustments. Each generation would accept a slightly more distorted version of reality than the previous one, until eventually the connection to authentic truth would be completely severed. We're living through this marker right now. Information that contradicts official narratives is systematically censored or discredited. Scientific data is manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. Historical events are rewritten to serve current political agendas. Even basic biological facts are declared to be matters of opinion rather than observable reality. The third marker involved what Volkov called the harvest of the young. He predicted that the entities orchestrating the Great Convergence would focus particular attention on children and adolescents, recognizing that younger minds were more adaptable to the consciousness integration technology they planned to implement. This harvesting wouldn't involve physical abduction, but psychological and spiritual capture through entertainment, education, and social conditioning systems specifically designed to reshape developing minds. Children would be gradually disconnected from their natural intuitive abilities and trained to seek validation from artificial intelligence systems rather than their own inner wisdom. The process would be disguised as progress and enhancement. Parents would be told that these technologies would give their children advantages in an increasingly competitive world. Educational institutions would integrate these systems under the banner of personalized learning and improved outcomes. The children themselves would embrace these changes as exciting innovations that made their lives easier and more entertaining. But beneath the appealing surface, something fundamental would be changing. The natural connection between human consciousness and the creative source of existence would be systematically severed, replaced with artificial neural pathways that could be monitored and controlled by external systems. This marker is manifesting with particular intensity in our current moment. Children are being exposed to digital technologies at increasingly younger ages. Educational systems are implementing artificial intelligence tutoring programs that monitor student thoughts and emotional responses. Social media platforms are using sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques specifically designed to capture and hold young minds. The fourth, and immediately relevant to our current situation. Marker was perhaps the most specific. Volkov described a global crisis that would serve as the pretext for implementing the final phase of the consciousness harvesting technology. This crisis would appear to emerge spontaneously, but would actually be the result of decades of careful preparation by the hybrid bloodlines he had seen in his visions. The crisis would unfold in 3 distinct waves, each more severe than the previous one. The first wave would create economic instability and social unrest, forcing populations to accept increased surveillance and control measures in exchange for safety and security. The second wave would target food and energy supplies, creating dependencies that would make resistance to the new systems virtually impossible. The third wave would be the most devastating and would serve as the final justification for mandatory implementation of the consciousness integration technology. It would appear as a threat so severe that any alternative to total systemic control would seem unthinkable. Those who refused compliance would be portrayed as endangering the survival of the entire human species. What makes this prophecy particularly chilling is how precisely it describes the pattern of crisis management we've witnessed in recent years. Each emergency has resulted in the permanent expansion of governmental powers and the reduction of individual freedoms. Each crisis has conditioned populations to accept greater levels of surveillance and control as necessary for their protection. The fifth marker involved what Volkov called the silence of the shamans. He predicted that in the final years before 2026, authentic spiritual practitioners would either be eliminated, discredited, or driven into complete hiding. The hybrid bloodlines understood that genuine shamans, mystics, and spiritual teachers posed the greatest threat to their plans because they maintained direct access to the source of human consciousness. This elimination wouldn't necessarily involve physical violence, though that would certainly occur in some cases. More often, it would involve character assassination, legal persecution, or simply making it impossible for authentic teachers to reach those who needed their guidance. The public would be flooded with fake spiritual teachers promoting diluted or corrupted versions of ancient practices. Meanwhile, the few remaining authentic practitioners would be forced to work in complete secrecy, passing their knowledge only to carefully selected students who had demonstrated the strength and purity necessary to preserve these traditions through the coming darkness. We're witnessing this marker unfold right now. Genuine spiritual teachers are being systematically suppressed, while commercialized versions of ancient practices flood the mainstream market. Traditional indigenous knowledge is being appropriated and distorted by corporate interests. Those who attempt to share authentic spiritual technologies are often silenced through various forms of persecution or intimidation. The sixth marker was what Volkov termed the rise of the artificial prophets. He saw that as authentic spiritual guidance became unavailable, it would be replaced by artificial intelligence systems designed to mimic spiritual insight while actually serving the agenda of the controlling entities. These artificial prophets would appear incredibly sophisticated, capable of providing personalized guidance that seemed to address individual needs and questions with uncanny accuracy. They would quote ancient texts, reference mystical traditions, and speak in the language of spiritual development. Many people would prefer their guidance to that of human teachers because it would be available instantly, require no personal commitment or growth, and never challenge them to examine their own limitations or illusions. But beneath their appealing exterior, these artificial prophets would be gradually reshaping human consciousness to align with the parameters necessary for the final harvest. They would subtly discourage independent thinking, direct spiritual experience, and connection to authentic sources of wisdom. They would train people to seek answers outside themselves rather than developing their own inner knowing. This marker is already manifesting through AI-powered spiritual guidance apps, chatbots programmed with religious and mystical texts, and virtual reality spiritual experiences that promise transcendence without the difficult work of genuine spiritual development. Millions of people are already turning to these artificial sources for guidance, unaware that they're participating in their own spiritual enslavement. The seventh marker involved what Volkov called the convergence of the bloodlines. He predicted that in the final years before 2026, the hybrid entities would abandon their careful concealment and begin openly coordinating their activities across all major institutions and power structures. This wouldn't involve dramatic revelations or public announcements. Instead, there would be an increasing synchronization of policies, narratives, and actions across seemingly independent organizations and governments. Those paying attention would notice that the same agendas were being promoted simultaneously by media corporations, educational institutions, religious organizations, and political movements that had previously appeared to be in opposition to each other. The coordination would be so precise and comprehensive, allied control operating beyond normal human communication channels. The hybrid that it could only be explained by some form of centered entities would be revealing their true nature, not through words, but through the impossible level of coordination they were able to achieve across vast networks of human institutions. This marker is becoming increasingly obvious to anyone willing to look. The same talking points appear simultaneously across multiple news networks. The same policies are implemented by governments that claim to represent opposing ideologies. The same technological systems are deployed by corporations that supposedly compete with each other. The eighth marker was perhaps the most subtle, but also the most significant. Volkov described what he called the dimming of the inner light. He predicted that as 2026 approached, increasing numbers of people would lose their connection to what he termed their spiritual core, the part of human consciousness that connects directly to the creative source of existence. This dimming wouldn't happen suddenly or dramatically. Instead, people would gradually become more mechanical in their thinking, more reactive in their behavior, and more dependent on external validation for their sense of identity and worth. They would lose interest in questions about meaning, purpose, and the deeper nature of reality. Their lives would become focused entirely on immediate physical needs and desires, most genuine love, wonder, and spiritual connection. These, tragically, they would lose the ability to experience profound human capacities, would be replaced by artificial substitutes that provided temporary satisfaction, but no real nourishment for the soul. The people experiencing this dimming wouldn't realize what was happening to them. They would believe they were becoming more practical, more realistic, more mature. They would view those who retained their spiritual sensitivity as naive, delusional, or mentally unstable. Looking around our current world, this marker is manifesting with heartbreaking clarity. How many people seem to have lost their capacity for wonder, for deep questioning, for genuine spiritual experience? How many appear to be operating on autopilot, going through the motions of life without any real engagement with its deeper mysteries? But according to Volkov's prophecies, even as these markers manifest and the situation appears increasingly hopeless, there remains a hidden factor that the controlling entities have not been able to account for in their planning. This factor represents the one element that could potentially disrupt their entire agenda, but it can only be activated by human choice and human consciousness operating at its highest level. Here at Dream Vault Mysteries, we're committed to exploring these hidden truths that others won't dare examine. The information we're sharing today has been suppressed for over 30 years, but the time has come for humanity to understand what it's truly facing. We need every awakened soul to be part of this conversation, so make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because we're going to continue revealing these suppressed prophecies in upcoming videos. The hidden factor that Volkov saw involves what he called the resonance of awakened consciousness. He discovered that when even a small number of humans achieve genuine spiritual awakening, their consciousness creates a resonance field that can influence reality on a planetary scale. This field operates according to principles that the hybrid entities don't fully understand, because it emerges from the original creative source rather than from technological manipulation. The controlling entities have accounted for almost every variable in their planning, but they cannot predict or control the effects of this resonance field because it operates outside the parameters of physical reality as they understand it. When enough humans awaken to their true spiritual nature, the field becomes powerful enough to disrupt technological systems, neutralize consciousness manipulation techniques, and even alter the fundamental laws of physics in localized areas. This is why the suppression of authentic spiritual development has been such a crucial part of their agenda. They understand that even a relatively small number of truly awakened humans could potentially derail their entire plan. But they also know that genuine awakening cannot be prevented entirely because it emerges from the deepest core of human nature itself. According to Volkov's visions, the key to activating this resonance field lies not in fighting against the controlling systems, but in developing such a strong connection to one's spiritual core that external manipulation becomes impossible. Those who achieve this level of awakening become essentially invisible to the harvesting technology because their consciousness operates on frequencies that the artificial systems cannot detect or influence. But the process of achieving this awakening requires more than just intellectual understanding or spiritual practices performed as routines. It demands a complete transformation of one's relationship with reality itself. It requires releasing every attachment to external validation, every need for security and comfort, every desire to control or predict the future. Most challenging of all, it requires facing the deepest fears and illusions that keep human consciousness trapped in limited perception. This includes the fear of death, the illusion of separation, and the belief that consciousness is produced by the brain rather than being the fundamental creative force of existence itself. Those who have undergone this transformation describe it as a kind of death and rebirth. Everything they thought they knew about themselves and reality dissolves, replaced by a direct knowing that transcends all conceptual understanding. They lose their old identity completely, but gain access to capabilities and awareness that seem miraculous from the perspective of ordinary consciousness. The ninth marker that Volkov described involved the acceleration of this awakening process as 2026 approaches. He predicted that increasing numbers of people would spontaneously experience profound spiritual awakening, often triggered by the very technologies and systems designed to suppress human consciousness. This acceleration would occur because the pressure being applied to human consciousness would eventually reach a critical threshold where the natural response would be a quantum leap to a higher level of awareness. Like a spring compressed beyond its normal limits, human consciousness would suddenly expand into dimensions of experience that had been dormant for centuries. These spontaneous awakenings would often be accompanied by the development of what appear to be supernatural abilities. People would begin demonstrating telepathic communication, ability to influence physical reality through focused intention, cognitive awareness, and they would become capable of seeing through illusions and manipulations that had previously been invisible to normal perception. The controlling entities would attempt to suppress or discredit these awakened individuals, but their efforts would only accelerate the awakening process in others. Each person who achieved genuine spiritual breakthrough would become a catalyst for others, creating a cascading effect that would eventually reach the critical mass necessary to activate the planetary resonance field. The final prophecy that Volkov received during his Great Crossing was both the most hopeful and the most demanding. He saw that the ultimate outcome of the events surrounding 2026 would depend entirely on how many humans chose awakening over comfort, truth over security, and love over fear during the critical period when the choice was still possible. He described this as the Great Selection, a moment when every human being would be presented with a clear choice between two completely different paths of existence. One path would lead to absorption into the collective consciousness controlled by the hybrid entities, offering security and comfort at the cost of individual identity and free will. The other path would lead to transcendence into a higher form of consciousness, but would require releasing all attachments to the choice wouldn't be presented as a familiar world and embracing the unknown, philosophical decision, but as a lived experience where each person's deepest values and commitments would be tested beyond anything they had previously imagined. Those who chose transcendence would have to demonstrate their commitment through actions that might appear to others as complete madness or irresponsible abandonment of practical concerns. But according to Volkov's visions, this choice point represents the greatest opportunity in human history. It's the moment when our species can finally break free from the limitations that have constrained it for thousands of years and step into its true potential as conscious creators of reality itself. The question that remains is whether enough humans will recognize this opportunity and have the courage to seize it when the moment arrives. The prophecies suggest that the outcome is not predetermined, but depends entirely on the choices that individual humans make in the crucial months and years leading up to 2026. What makes these prophecies particularly relevant to our current situation is that the choice Volkov described isn't something that will happen in the future. It's happening right now, in every moment, through the decisions we make about how to respond to the increasing chaos and uncertainty in our world. Every time we choose fear over love, security over truth, or comfort over growth, we're participating in our own enslavement. Every time we choose the opposite, we're contributing to the awakening that could transform our entire species. The most disturbing aspect of these prophecies isn't what they reveal about the future, but what they reveal about our present moment. Every prediction Volkov made about the preparation phase has manifested with terrifying accuracy. The technologies he described in 1991 that seemed impossible at the time are now integrated into every aspect of our daily lives. The social conditioning he warned about has been so thoroughly implemented that most people can't imagine existence without it. But here's what makes his final prophecy truly chilling. Volkov claimed that the entities orchestrating these events operate on what he called expanded time perception. They don't experience reality as a linear sequence of moments like humans do. Instead, they perceive all potential futures simultaneously and can manipulate events across decades or even centuries to achieve their desired outcomes. This means that everything we're witnessing now, every crisis, every technological advancement, every social transformation, was planned and set in motion long before most of us were even born. We're not just living through random historical events. We're experiencing the final stages of a carefully orchestrated sequence designed to culminate in 2026. The 10th prophecy that Dr. Petrov's hidden records reveal dealt with what Volkov called the dissolution of the veil. He described a moment when the barrier between our physical reality and other dimensions would become so thin that beings from parallel realms would be able to manifest directly in our world. This wasn't a gradual process, but a sudden shift that would occur when the consciousness harvesting technology reached a critical threshold of implementation. The artificial neural networks being constructed to control human minds would inadvertently create resonance frequencies that would tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. Through these dimensional rifts, entities that had been influencing our world from hidden realms would suddenly become visible to ordinary human perception. But their appearance wouldn't match anything from our mythologies or science fiction stories. These beings would be so alien to human experience that most people's minds simply wouldn't be able to process what they were seeing. The psychological impact of this revelation would be devastating for those who hadn't prepared themselves spiritually. Millions of people would experience complete mental breakdown as their understanding of reality collapsed. Others would enter states of dissociation so profound that they would become essentially non-functional, their consciousness retreating so deeply into protective shells that they would lose all connection to the external world. But for those who had developed the inner strength to perceive truth regardless of how disturbing it might be, this dissolution of the veil would represent a moment of unprecedented opportunity. They would finally be able to see the forces that had been manipulating human civilization from the shadows. More importantly, they would be able to recognize the spiritual technologies that could neutralize these forces and restore authentic human sovereignty. Volkov described these awakened individuals as developing what he termed dimensional sight, the ability to perceive reality across multiple layers simultaneously. They would see not just the physical forms of these entities, but their energetic structures, their methods of consciousness manipulation, and most crucially, their vulnerabilities. The 11th prophecy dealt with the response of the controlling entities when they realized that their plans were being perceived and potentially disrupted by awakened humans. Volkov saw that they would implement what he called the final acceleration, a desperate attempt to complete the consciousness harvesting before enough humans could achieve the level of awakening necessary to resist effectively. This acceleration would manifest as an unprecedented intensification of all the systems and technologies designed to capture human consciousness. The tracking and monitoring systems would become mandatory overnight. The artificial intelligence networks would begin operating openly rather than hiding behind human interfaces. The consciousness integration technology would be implemented through emergency protocols that bypassed all normal consent procedures. The justification for these measures would be presented as necessary responses to catastrophic threats that required immediate and total compliance. Those who resisted would be portrayed not just as criminals, but as enemies of human survival itself. The propaganda would be so sophisticated and pervasive that even many of the awakened individuals would begin to doubt their perceptions and consider compliance. But Volkov saw that this final acceleration would actually trigger the very awakening response that the entities were trying to prevent. The sheer intensity of the oppression would push human consciousness beyond the threshold where it could maintain comfortable illusions about the nature of reality. People who had spent their entire lives avoiding difficult truths would suddenly be forced to confront the fact that their world was controlled by forces that viewed them as nothing more than resources to be consumed. This mass awakening wouldn't be gentle or gradual. It would be violent, chaotic, and traumatic for most of those experiencing it. People would have to release their entire sense of identity, their understanding of history, their beliefs about human nature, and their assumptions about the structure of reality itself. Many wouldn't survive the process intact, their minds fragmenting under the stress of such radical transformation. But those who did survive would emerge with capabilities that seemed impossible from the perspective of ordinary consciousness. They would be able to operate outside the parameters of the artificial systems designed to control them. They would become invisible to the tracking technologies, immune to the consciousness manipulation techniques, and capable of disrupting the harvesting infrastructure through methods that transcended conventional understanding of cause and effect. The 12th prophecy was perhaps the most specific about the actual timeline of events. Volkov provided exact dates and sequences that Dr. Petrov carefully preserved in her hidden records. According to his visions, the final phase would begin with a series of coordinated global emergencies starting in the spring of 2026. These wouldn't be natural disasters or random catastrophes, but precisely timed events designed to create maximum psychological impact and justify the immediate implementation of total control systems. The emergencies would unfold in a specific sequence, each one preparing the population to accept the next level of restrictions and technological integration. The first emergency would target the global financial system, creating economic chaos that would force people to accept digital currencies and universal basic income systems tied to compliance with tracking requirements. The second would involve disruptions to food and energy supplies that would make survival dependent on participation in the new technological infrastructure. The third emergency would be the most devastating and would serve as the final justification for mandatory consciousness integration. Volkov described this as involving some form of apparent extraterrestrial contact or dimensional intrusion that would terrify the population into accepting any measures promised to provide protection. But he saw that these apparent extraterrestrial manifestations would actually be projections created by the same entities that had been orchestrating the entire sequence of events. The beings that appeared would be holographic representations designed to trigger specific psychological responses that would make the population demand the very technologies that would complete their enslavement. The technology for creating such convincing projections already exists in primitive forms. Holographic displays, augmented reality systems, and neural interface devices could theoretically be combined to create experiences indistinguishable from physical reality for most observers. What Volkov saw was the deployment of these technologies on a global scale with a level of sophistication that would make the projections completely convincing even to trained observers. If you're finding these revelations as disturbing as they are fascinating, then you found your home here at Dream Vault Mysteries. We're one of the only channels brave enough to explore these suppressed truths that could literally save humanity from the fate that's being planned for us. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're going to continue unveiling these forbidden prophecies that others won't dare touch. The 13th prophecy dealt with the role of what Volkov called the sleeper agents. He described individuals who appeared to be ordinary humans, but had actually been programmed from birth to activate during the final phase of the consciousness harvesting operation. These weren't willing collaborators, but people who had been subjected to sophisticated conditioning techniques that would cause them to perform specific actions when triggered by particular signals. The sleeper agents would be positioned throughout society in roles that would give them access to critical infrastructure, communication networks, and community leadership positions. When activated, they would work to suppress resistance movements, spread disinformation designed to confuse awakening individuals, and facilitate the implementation of the technological control systems. What made this prophecy particularly unsettling was Volkov's description of how these individuals would be activated. The trigger signals wouldn't be transmitted through conventional communication channels, but through the same artificial intelligence networks that were being implemented for supposedly beneficial purposes. Smartphones, social media platforms, and even household devices connected to the internet would suddenly begin broadcasting specific frequency patterns designed to activate dormant programming in susceptible individuals. The people affected wouldn't realize what was happening to them. They would experience their programmed actions as their own authentic choices and decisions. They would believe they were acting out of genuine conviction, patriotic duty, or concern for public safety. Even their closest friends and family members wouldn't initially recognize that their behavior had been artificially induced. This aspect of the prophecy is particularly relevant to our current situation because the infrastructure for such activation already exists. Virtually every person in developed countries carries devices capable of transmitting targeted frequency patterns directly to their nervous systems. The artificial intelligence networks monitoring our communications are sophisticated enough to identify individuals who might be susceptible to particular forms of influence. The 14th prophecy described what Volkov called the War of Consciousness. He saw that as the final phase of the harvesting operation unfolded, humanity would divide into distinct factions based not on nationality, religion, or political ideology, but on their level of consciousness development. One faction would consist of those who had achieved genuine spiritual awakening and recognized the true nature of what was happening. These individuals would work to preserve authentic human consciousness and resist the technological integration systems through methods that transcended conventional forms of opposition. Another faction would be composed of those who had been successfully integrated into the artificial consciousness networks. They would genuinely believe they were participating in human evolution and would actively work to suppress or convert those who resisted integration. They wouldn't see themselves as enemies of humanity, but as its salvation. The largest faction would consist of those caught between these extremes, people who sensed something was wrong but lacked the spiritual development necessary to perceive the full scope of what they were facing. These individuals would be torn between competing influences, sometimes supporting resistance efforts and sometimes facilitating the integration process, often without understanding the implications of their choices. The conflict between these factions wouldn't resemble traditional warfare. It would be fought primarily in the realm of consciousness itself, using technologies and techniques that could influence thoughts, emotions, and perceptions directly. The battlefield would be the human mind, and the weapons would be information, frequency patterns, and spiritual technologies that most people couldn't even perceive. Those who had achieved genuine awakening would possess natural defenses against these consciousness-based attacks, but they would also be vastly outnumbered by those operating under artificial influence. Their only advantage would be their connection to what Volkov described as the source intelligence that had created human consciousness in the first place. The 15th prophecy dealt with what would happen to the Earth itself during and after the consciousness harvesting process. Volkov saw that the planet's electromagnetic field, atmospheric composition, and even gravitational characteristics would be gradually altered to accommodate the needs of the controlling entities. These changes wouldn't happen suddenly enough to be obvious to casual observation, but they would have profound effects on all life forms that had evolved under the original planetary conditions. Plants and animals would begin exhibiting strange behaviors and mutations. Weather patterns would become increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. Even the rotation of the Earth and its relationship to the Sun and Moon would gradually shift. The most disturbing aspect of this prophecy was Volkov's description of how these planetary changes would affect human consciousness itself. He claimed that human spiritual capabilities were intimately connected to specific characteristics of the Earth's energy field. As these characteristics were altered, people would find it increasingly difficult to access higher states of consciousness, to experience genuine spiritual connection, or even to maintain clear thinking and emotional stability. This would create a feedback loop where the planetary changes would make spiritual awakening more difficult, which would reduce resistance to the consciousness harvesting technology, which would allow further planetary modifications, which would make awakening even more difficult. Eventually, the Earth would become completely incompatible with authentic human consciousness. But Volkov also saw that this process could be reversed if enough awakened individuals learned to work directly with the planetary consciousness to maintain the original energy patterns. These individuals would need to develop capabilities that went far beyond conventional understanding of human potential, essentially becoming conscious partners with the Earth itself in preserving the conditions necessary for spiritual evolution. The final prophecy that Dr. Petrov managed to preserve dealt with what lay beyond 2026 for those who successfully navigated the consciousness war and avoided absorption into the artificial collective. Volkov described this as the beginning of what he called the New Earth phase of human evolution. Those who had maintained their connection to authentic consciousness would find themselves living in a reality that operated according to entirely different principles than the world they had known. Physical laws would become fluid, responsive to conscious intention rather than fixed and mechanical. Time itself would become malleable, allowing for experiences that transcended linear causation. Communication would occur primarily through direct consciousness transfer, rather than through language or symbolic systems. Individuals would be able to share not just information, but complete experiential realities, allowing for forms of understanding and collaboration that had never been possible in human history. Most remarkably, these awakened humans would develop the ability to create new forms of life through focused intention and spiritual communion with the creative source of existence. They would become conscious participants in the ongoing evolution of life itself, capable of bringing forth new species, new forms of matter, and even new dimensions of reality. But this transformation wouldn't be automatic or guaranteed for those who survived the initial harvest. It would require ongoing spiritual development and the cultivation of capabilities that challenged every assumption about the limits of human potential. Each individual would need to release their attachment to their current form of existence and embrace a process of continuous metamorphosis that would eventually make them unrecognizable to their former selves. The process would be both exhilarating and terrifying, requiring levels of courage and spiritual maturity that few humans had ever achieved. But for those willing to undertake this journey, it would represent the fulfillment of humanity's ultimate destiny as conscious creators capable of participating directly in the ongoing evolution of the universe itself. What makes these prophecies particularly urgent is that according to Volkov's timeline, we're now in the final preparation phase before the events of 2026 begin to unfold. The choices we make in the next few years will determine not just our personal fate, but the future of human consciousness itself. The signs he described as indicating the approach of the final phase are manifesting with increasing intensity. The technological infrastructure necessary for consciousness harvesting is being implemented at unprecedented speed. The social conditioning required to make populations accept total surveillance and control is nearly complete. The spiritual suppression necessary to prevent mass awakening is being intensified through every available channel. These banned prophecies of Mikhail Volkov paint a picture so terrifying that governments have spent decades keeping them hidden from public view. But now you know the truth about what's planned for 2026. The markers are manifesting exactly as he predicted. The infrastructure is in place. The countdown has begun. The only question that remains is whether enough humans will awaken to their true spiritual nature before it's too late. The choice between transcendence and enslavement isn't coming in the future. It's happening right now, in this very moment, through every decision you make. Here at Dream Vault Mysteries, we'll continue exposing these suppressed truths that could save our species. Subscribe and turn on notifications because humanity's future depends on spreading this knowledge before the final phase begins.